Comments on the method of Marx's Capital and its importance for contemporary Marxist scholarship by Roman Rosdolsky. This is from 1974, published in New German Critique. Translated by David Bathrick and Anson Rabenbach. Section 1. The organizers of this colloquium wisely chose to sum up its major theme in the one brief sentence: the critique of political economy today. In so doing, they have obviously attempted to express two things. First, in Capital, Marx was not merely concerned with a critique of this or that national economic theorem or school, indeed not even with a critique of what he was accustomed to characterizing as, quote, bourgeois economy. Rather, Marx aimed at the critique of political economy in toto. That is to say, Marx was concerned with the critique of a science of social relations of production, which are, quote, always tied to things and appear as things, end quote, and which, for that reason, are and must remain caught within the categories of, quote, reification. Second, it seems to me that through the choice of this topic, the attempt was made to express the continued immediacy of Marx's dialectical method of investigation even after 100 years. From this point of view, his economic work can rightly be seen as the, quote, critique of political economy today, end quote. It is obvious from the above that we consider the method of Capital to be the most valuable and lasting element of his whole economic edifice, and for that reason see as the central task of Marxist scholarship today the study and application of this method. Section 2. There is hardly an aspect of Marx's theory which has been treated more negligently than the method of Capital. By this we do not mean in any way to belittle the theoretical achievements of former Marxists. Here we may include not only such gifted or original Marxist thinkers as Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky, but we could also point to Hilferding's classic Das Finanzkapital, or to the brilliant economic analyses of Otto Bauer. Nevertheless, many Marxist theoreticians must be subjected to the same criticisms that Marx himself leveled at classical political economy. And when he accused classical political economy of, quote, brutal interest in content, end quote, a lack of interest in grasping the differences in the form of economic relations, end quote. Of course, there are good reasons for this neglect of method. It was understandable as long as socialist theoreticians saw their main task as popularizing the Marxist theory of value and surplus value. In this regard, Karl Kautsky rendered invaluable services. How many thousands of Marxists first began to read and understand the first volume of Capital as a result of Kautsky's book, The Economic Teachings of Karl Marx. Admittedly, a certain leveling resulted from this popularization, particularly insofar as people restricted themselves to the first volume of Capital, making it more difficult to grasp the total context of Marx's work and its methodological presuppositions. But even more ominous for Marxist theory was the fact that the supremacy of reformism within the Second International had led increasingly to the abandonment of the dialectical view of totality in favor of blatant empiricism. This was all the more disastrous since most Marxist theoreticians of that era were oriented towards positivism or neo-Kantianism, and therefore had lost sight of Marx's theoretical starting point, Hegel's thought. Small wonder, then, that the original purpose of Marx's critique of political economy was lost, and that this critique itself was increasingly understood in the sense of a mechanistic, naturalistic individual science. Precisely for this reason, we find numerous parallels between Marxist economic interpretations of that time and the teachings of Ricardo or even Say. We see this in the question of the role of use value in the economy, in theories of value and money, and in the crisis theory. The interpretations of the second volume of Capital are perhaps the best examples in this regard. Although this volume is equal to the first in its dialectical subtlety and conceptual clarity, and may even surpass it, it was rarely read and still less understood by educated Marxists. To be sure, Kautsky treated this volume briefly in Neue Zeit of 1885, in which he discussed in 3 pages the essential third section of Volume 2, the reproduction process of total social capital, while dispensing with the famous schema of expanded reproduction with 2 short lines. Quote, "The accumulation of surplus value and the expansion of the production process result in further complications." End quote. This represents literally everything written about the second volume of Capital in German during the succeeding 2 decades. The first work to direct the attention of social democratic theorists, such as Hilferding and Bauer, to the third section, and in particular to the reproduction schema of Volume 2, was written by the Russian revisionist Tugen Baranovsky, and appeared in 1903. These authors were primarily concerned with providing proof, with the help of the schema, that capitalism was not threatened by economic collapse, and that the crises of overproduction were to be understood as mere crises of disproportionality. Thus we have an obvious neo-harmonious interpretation, attributable to the fact that the above authors naively confused the abstract schema of the second volume with concrete capitalist reality. As a result, they failed to understand that these schema represent only one phase, albeit extremely important, of Marx's investigation of the accumulation process, and for that reason had to be explained in Marx's theory of crisis and collapse. In the short-lived blossoming of the Soviet economy in the 1920s, meant a radical break with the neglect of Marx's economic method. Of particular significance in this regard were the outstanding contributions of Preobrazhensky, as well as the methodological investigations of Isaac Illich Rubin and his school. Nevertheless, this promising development was cruelly interrupted a decade later, and what followed was for social and political reasons, which we need not describe, so crude and mindless, that the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s can now be described as a dead and barren time for Marxist economic theory. Only in the last few years, mainly in Western Europe, have the failings of a new interpretation of capital emerged. only in the last few years, mainly in Western Europe, have the beginnings of a new interpretation of capital emerged, which I am happy to say returned to its methodological and philosophical premises. Fortunately, Marx scholars today can rely on the recently published Grundrisse, which opens the door to Marx's economic laboratory and lays bare all the subtleties and hidden paths of his methodology. Here we are reminded of Lenin's aphorism of 1915. Quote, "It is impossible to completely understand Marx's Capital, and especially its first chapter, without having thoroughly studied and understood the whole of Hegel's logic. Consequently, half a century later, none of the Marxists have understood Marx." End quote. I have no idea how many Marxists have seriously considered Lenin's remark, and how many have followed his advice. Yet I am now of the opinion that the appearance of the Grundrisse has perhaps eliminated the necessity to bite into this bitter fruit and, quote, thoroughly study the whole of Hegel's logic, end quote, in order to understand Marx's Capital. The same results can be achieved more directly through the study of the Grundrisse itself. It is precisely the Grundrisse which demonstrates the extent to which the construction of capital is dialectical to its very core, and indicates the decisive role Marx attributed to the categories of method derived from Hegel. These categories include the relationship between content and form, essence and appearance, the general, the particular, and the individual, between immediacy and mediation, between difference, opposition, and contradiction, etc. Not being a professional philosopher, I shall not presume to speak exhaustively on this subject. Instead, I will limit myself to what should be apparent to a layman studying the Grundrisse, in the hope that my occasionally false conclusions will be corrected by those who are more competent. Section 3. First, let us consider an obvious problem concerning the relation between the logical and the historical modes of perception in Marx's work. The so-called historicism of Marx's Capital has been stressed so often in such an insipid way that any reader first taking up the Grundrisse is struck by the fact that this work seems to be merely a, quote, dialectic of concepts, in which economic categories take on a life of their own, separating and merging in true Hegelian fashion. It is evident from a notation in the Grundrisse that Marx himself anticipated just such a misinterpretation. Speaking about the development of the concept of value in money, he says, quote, "Later it will be necessary to correct the idealistic manner of presentation, which gives the impression that this is only concerned with conceptual formations and their dialectic," end quote. In another passage, Marx enlarges upon what seemed at first only a conceptual deduction of the relations of capital, by noting that a long historical development and many economic transformations were required in order for capital to confront labor as a commodity in the market. Marx concludes, quote, "This point clearly reveals how the dialectical form of presentation is correct only if the dialectical form of presentation knows its limits," end quote. If in spite of this Marx gives preference in his economic work to logical development, he does so only insofar as logical development offers in his eyes, quote, the key to the understanding of historical development, end quote. In reality, then, Marx's logical mode of conceptualizing the economy, as Engels said, quote, is ultimately a historical one, stripped of its historical form and disturbing accidents, end quote. It provides, therefore, albeit abstractly, a mirror image of the real historical process. Quote, a corrected mirror image, but corrected according to principles which permit us to grasp the real historical processes so that every moment can be viewed at the developmental point of its full maturity, at the moment of its classical perfection, end quote. It is well known that in contrast to the classics, Marx's entire theoretical thrust was directed towards, quote, discovering the specific principles which govern the birth, the existence, the development, and the death of a given social organism and its supersession by another higher one, end quote. How then can theory attain knowledge of specific principles which are themselves only historical in nature? And how can such principles be brought into harmony with general economic determinants which are applicable at all social epochs? Since, quote, all epochs of production have certain characteristics in common, end quote. Quote, it can be said that in all epochs the subject, humanity, and the object, nature, are one and the same, end quote. By concentrating on these common determinants, nothing could be easier than, quote, dissolving all historical differences into general human laws, end quote. But if, for example, quote, the most highly developed languages have determinants in common with the least developed, then it is precisely its development that distinguishes it from the general and common, end quote. In exactly the same way, economic theory must investigate the developmental laws of the capitalist epoch so that recognition, quote, of the unity, end quote, of common determinants this epoch shares with earlier epochs will not make us forget, quote, their essential differences, end quote. What constitutes development in the economic sphere? Precisely the economic sphere's specific historical character. Quote, as long as the labor process, end quote, we read in capital, quote, is only a mere process between persons and nature, the labor process's simple elements remain common to all social forms of development, end quote. But every particular historical stage of this process, quote, further develops its material foundations and social forms, end quote. And precisely these social forms, in contrast to the naturally given, quote, content, are what is important. For it is just these forms which distinguish individual socioeconomic epochs from one another. Thus, it is clear that in all class societies, the surplus product produced directly by the producers is appropriated by the ruling class. But what constitutes the difference between various economic epochs is whether this occurs in the form of slave labor, serfdom, or wage labor. This is a fact that most recent Anglo-Saxon Marxist literature seems to neglect in its analysis of monopoly capitalism. It ignores the concept of surplus value and attempts to replace the concept of surplus value with the general concept of surplus product. The significance of the form-content problem is not limited to distinguishing between individual economic epochs. What Marx is really dealing with in his investigation of the capitalist economy are not things, but rather social processes appearing in a thing-like shell. However, processes can only be investigated if the central focus is directed toward the changing forms of the objects under investigation. In this sense, Marx's economy is nothing more than a history of forms, which are successively taken up and cast aside by, quote, ever proceeding capital, end quote, in its development through various phases. For this reason, it is easy to understand the great significance Marx attributed to the methodological form-content problem, particularly in his economics, and why he criticized the classical economists from this standpoint. Since the classics considered the specific forms of production and distribution as unchangeable and natural, and since the classics' starting point presupposed these principles, they could only view the forms of bourgeois production as phenomenon which did not encompass production content, i.e. the production of use values or goods. Furthermore, they were convinced of the necessary merging, Zusammenfallen, of, quote, forms and, quote, content. In contrast, according to Marx's dialectical conception, the respective content and the forms to which it gives birth find themselves in constant interchange and struggle. As a result, form is stripped away and content is transformed. If, however, form is viewed as something peripheral, exterior to content, then one must either neglect form, like the classical economists, sacrifice form to content, or absolutize this form. Soviet economists serve as an example of the latter. Proceeding from the conditions that any future society will still need to distribute the quantum of social labor at that future society's disposal, and measure that society's the quantum of social labor at its disposal in labor time expended, they draw the conclusion that value as an economic category will continue to prevail under socialism. In other words, Soviet economists deduce from the, quote, suprahistorical basis by which value is determined, a suprahistorical character inherent in the value form itself. We have already established that Marx's economics is concerned above all with the social forms of production and distribution. In saying this, we in no way exhaust the methodology of capital. Obviously, distinctions must be made between what is essential and inessential, between fundamental forms and, quote, mere forms of appearance. Quote, all science, Marx says, quote, would be superfluous if apparent form were directly identical with essence, end quote. Since apparent form and essence are not directly identical, scientific scholarship must never limit itself simply to, quote, grasping the appearances on the surface, end quote. Rather, scientific scholarship must penetrate further from the mere, quote, apparent forms to the, quote, inner essence, to the hidden, quote, structural core of economic processes. Only in this way can it locate the, quote, principle of appearance and grasp this appearance as necessary. Naturally, this penetration to the inner essence of economic processes presupposes the discovery of those, quote, mediations, which connect this essence with the appearance on the surface, and in which the rationally ordered interaction of all social life is expressed. In this sense, Lassalle's characterization of Hegelian philosophy as a, quote, conceptual system of mediations, end quote, is valid for Marx's economic system as well. The difference, to be sure, is that Marx's, quote, system of mediations is not content with mere concepts, but is directed towards grasping the totality of the empirical world. Here we arrive at the fundamental distinction for Marxist economics between, quote, capital in general and, quote, many capitals. Up to now, very little consideration has been given to the high level of conceptual abstraction in Marx's Capital. Many objections by academic critics of Marx could have been avoided had there been clear understanding on this point. In truth, only a few critics of Marx have understood that the underlying assumption found in the first two volumes of this work, namely that commodities are exchanged at their value, is of purely methodological character, and is not intended to express anything about concrete reality. The so-called Berkowitz problem, Berkowitz? I can't remember. I don't know how to pronounce his name. The so-called Berkowitz problem, which has even confused a few Marxists, also belongs in this category. But these are trivial objections which result from misunderstanding the structure of Marx's work. In the first two volumes, Marx intentionally ignores such issues as the average rate of profit, production prices which deviate from values, etc. The first two volumes deal exclusively with, quote, capital in general. But what is really meant by the concept capital in general? As a start, we should consider the answer contained in a letter from Marx to Kugelmann. Here this concept was interpreted in such a way as to exclude consideration of competing capitals. Competition, it says in the Grundrisse, is, quote, the relation of capital to itself as another capital, i.e. the conduct of capital as capital, end quote. Only through this relationship, quote, is that which corresponds to the concept of capital posited as an external necessity for the individual capital, end quote. Conceptually, therefore, competition is, quote, nothing but the inner nature of capital, appearing and realized as the interaction of many capitals, end quote, which, quote, forces the inherent determinants of capital upon one another and upon themselves, end quote. As such, competition is, quote, the essential driving force of the bourgeois economy, end quote. Even if competition doesn't create its principles, but only realizes them. Even if competition does not explain its principles, but only makes them visible. Therefore, nothing could be worse than to confuse a thorough investigation of these principles with an analysis of competition or an analysis of the credit relationships which presuppose competition, etc., despite the fact that in competition everything necessarily presents itself in inverted form. In order to investigate the inherent laws of capital in its pure form, it is necessary to abstract from competition and its accompanying appearances, and to start from, quote, capital as such, or, quote, capital in general. Quote, the intrusion of many capitals, end quote, the Grundrisse continues, quote, must not disturb the perception of the problem. The relationship of the many cannot be explained after that which they have in common. Can only be explained after that which they have in common, namely being capital, is perceived. What then are the characteristics shared by all capitals? Obviously those which are only valid for capital and not for other forms of wealth. Capital distinguishes itself from mere value or money, first of all, by the fact that capital is, quote, surplus reproducing value, end quote. And that a specific historically determined social relationship lies at the base of capital, the wage-labor relationship. To be sure, in the concrete world of economics, quote, much is subsumed under capital that doesn't appear to belong there according to capital's concept, end quote. But in all such cases, it is a question of merely secondary phenomenon that must be put aside for the moment. For in the investigation of, quote, capital in general, we are, quote, still concerned neither with a particular form of capital, nor with an individual capital as distinct from individual capitals. We are present at the process of its becoming. This dialectical process of capital's becoming is only the ideal expression of the real movement through which capital comes into being. The latter relations are to be regarded as developments coming out of this germ, end quote. Quote, the exact development of the concept of capital, end quote, Marx emphasizes in this context, is necessary because the concept of capital is the fundamental concept of modern economics, just as capital itself, whose abstract reflected image, capital's concept, is the foundation of bourgeois society. The sharp formulation of the basic presuppositions of the relation must bring out all the contradictions of bourgeois production, as well as the boundary where bourgeois production drives beyond itself, end quote. The goal for the abstraction of, quote, capital in general is to, quote, is to pursue the, quote, life history, end quote, of capital in all its phases. Thus, the analysis must begin with the investigation of the production process of capital. It must show how money, quote, goes beyond its simple determination as money, end quote, and becomes capital, by producing surplus value through the consumption of human labor, and how, finally, the production of surplus value, for its part, leads to the reproduction of capital and the relations of capital. But all this can be developed without having to consider the presence of several capitals and the difference between several capitals. If we are to understand, quote, the basic presuppositions of capital relations, the relation of capital to work and the role of surplus value as the driving force of capitalist production, then we cannot start with, quote, many capitals, but rather the capital. That is, quote, the capital of the entire society, end quote, with, quote, capital in general. Only in this way is the real development of the concept of capital possible. However, the life history of capital is not limited to the immediate production process. In order for capital to renew itself, the product of capital, including the surplus product, must be transformed into money. In this way, the production process phase is completed by the circulation process. The movement of capital thus becomes a cycle in which new forms, fixed in circulating capital, augment it. Forms which are derived from temporary determinations of capital, but which harden into particular modes of existence. These forms are also to be grasped as distinctions within the abstraction of capital in general, since these forms, fixed in circulating capital, quote, characterize every kind of capital, and therefore have to be understood, quote, without regard for the interaction of many capitals, end quote. On the other hand, the progression of these various phases of circulation by means of capital now appear as a limitation on its production. Circulation simply costs time, and during this time, capital cannot produce surplus value. Its realization depends not only on the length of time in which capital produces values, but just as much on the rate of circulation in which these values are realized. Accordingly, surplus value is now, quote, no longer measured by its essential measure, namely the relation of surplus value to necessary labor, end quote, but rather by the volume of capital itself. Quote, a capital of a particular value produces in a particular time span a particular surplus value, end quote. Surplus value thus finally assumes the transformed form of profit, and the rate of surplus value assumes the form of the rate of profit. However, according to the Grundrisse, this consideration, quote, belongs only to the consideration of many capitals, and thus does not emerge at this point, end quote. Since the creation of the average rate of profit and the corresponding transformation of value into production prices presupposes competition. The latter, however, remains excluded from the investigation of capital in general. Section 4. Enough said concerning the construction of Marx's work as this plan is presented in the Grundrisse. What Marx sketched there, in the Grundrisse, in 1857, is also basically the program of his final work. For just as in the Grundrisse, volumes 1 and 2 of Capital are also limited, in Marx's own words, merely to the, quote, abstract view of the phenomenon of capital formation, end quote. I.e., they are confined to the analysis of the process of circulation and reproduction, quote, in its fundamental form, end quote, to the consideration of, quote, capital in general, end quote. The actual methodological difference begins only with Volume 3. As is well known, Volume 3 was intended to investigate those formations of capital which, quote, gradually approach the form in which they themselves appear on the surface of society, in the action of different capitals vis-a-vis one another, in competition, in the normal consciousness of the producers, end quote. At this point, the investigation of capital in general is left behind. As Marx himself repeatedly emphasizes in Volume 3, he is initially concerned only with the investigation of, quote, the inner organization of the capitalist mode of production in its average cross-section, end quote. The actual theory of competition lies, quote, outside the plan of this work, end quote, and belongs to its, quote, eventual continuation, end quote. Thus it says in one of the final chapters of Volume 3, quote, in our description of how production relations are converted into entities and rendered independent in relation to the agents of production, we leave aside the manner in which the interrelations, due to the world market, its conjunctures, movements of market prices, periods of credit, industrial and commercial cycles, alternations of prosperity and crisis, appear to them as overwhelming natural laws that irresistibly enforce their will over them and confront them as blind necessity, end quote. Here, Marx himself lays out the problem that he reserves for the, quote, eventual continuation, end quote, of his work, and which for that reason are treated in capital only in a fragmentary way, and only as necessitated by the treatment of other issues. We see the most important of these problems as being the investigation of the world market, the problems of economic crises, and the problem of the, quote, real movement of market prices, end quote, which Marx in another passage explicitly relegated to, quote, a special investigation of competition, end quote. Unfortunately, these methodological suggestions were never heeded by later Marxist scholarship. As a result, many scholars found themselves in an unfortunate situation similar to that of Orthodox Ricardians of the 1800s. The Orthodox Ricardians of that time sought to apply directly the correct yet abstract teachings of their master, devoid of any mediations. So the phenomenon of the world of appearances, which prima facie seem to contradict them, in so doing, they either attempted arbitrarily to subsume these phenomena under a general principle, or they simply denied these phenomena's existence. The same is true mutatis mutandis for many Marxists, who, for example, ignore the problem of the, quote, real movement of market price, end quote, or who attempt to find in Marx's Capital the complete and final solution to the crisis problem. They simply forgot that also in Marx's work, as he himself said of Ricardo, theory must work itself out of the wealth of theory's living substratum. Theory out of those very appearances which seem to contradict theory. Furthermore, theory cannot be applied to real developments in a state of constant flux without the necessary mediations. The situation of Marxist theory has become particularly critical since the last World War, with the profound upheavals undergone by Western capitalism, and with the necessity of also analyzing the new social structures which have emerged in the East. Once again, to quote Marx, theory, quote, must work its way up through the rich soil of contradictions, end quote. If theory expects to do justice to concrete reality and the new situations which it presents to us today. And our theory can do it. If it distances itself, if our theory distances itself from dogmatism of any kind, and if it learns to apply the infinitely fruitful method of capital correctly, i.e., if it is able to discover those mediations which connect the abstract theorems of this work with the concrete reality of today. Precisely that, it seems to us, is the central task of contemporary Marxist economics. If our contribution is helped in any way to bring to consciousness this theoretical task, then its purpose has been fulfilled.